Thanks, Molly. Hi, everybody. This is Alex. Welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. Tonight, we got a pretty cool show for you. We're going to tell you all about filters. Jim's going to tell you all about filters. The rest of us are just going to be watching and helping answer questions and things like that. So we're glad to see you here. I'd like to tell you about a few of the things that are coming up. And so I'm going to share my screen here. And let's see if I got that right. Okay. Jim is here tonight. Tell us about astronomical filters. And Bruce, I saw this presentation at Nightfall last year, and I thought it was kind of cute. Ain't exactly what we normally do, but before I tell you any more, I'm gonna stop my sharing, and I'm gonna ask Bruce to speak up for just a little bit about hey, Bruce, what's happening next week?
How to do, guys? I love long exposures, showing the movement of the stars through star trails, showing the movement of the moon. But I got stuck on how to show the movement of the sun because it's shining all day and it's very long. And how do you do that for a long time? So got into pinhole photography using solography, using a pinhole camera called a solar cam. And so rather than having a multi-$1,000 gear, how do you share that with your family, friends, grandkids? Here you got a $25 can, solar camera in a can, and you get some amazing artistic images. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you next week.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much, Bruce. And then we've got some other things coming up. Back to the calendar, guys. Okay. Dennis is can you imagine we've got aurora stretching way down into at least Northern California, and I've heard even into Southern California. And Bruce is up there, I think right about now, taking pictures of the aurora. So he ought to have a lot of stories to tell us. Or Dennis rather is Dennis is coming. Anyway, he's going to tell us about shooting auroras and stuff like that. He does it all the time, and that's pretty cool. I've been up there with him in Alaska, and then we take a week off because we're going to go see NEAF and NEAC, where Tim is going to be presenting, among others. Be sure to say hi to us when we see you so that, and another thing you can do is volunteer to fill up these empty days. Just say, hey, Alex, I've always thought it'd be cool if I could be on the Astro Imaging channel. What do you think? And I'll probably say, well, let's see if you can put 3 sentences together right now. And if you can, well, maybe we'll put you on. Okay. So guys, be sure to say hi to Tim. Be sure to say hi to me. I'm not sure who all the rest of us is coming, but we should have some fun. And Steve Miller, who has been posting a lot on cloudy nights, he images with the 16-inch Dove and takes and it's it's not all that fancified. He doesn't have a rotator or anything like that. Just takes a lot of short exposures and adds them together. A lot of good stuff. But you notice May 14th we've got open, May 28th we've got open, and we've got a few others. Frank Sackenheim just joined us tonight. He's going to talk about Graxpert, which is a really good program for getting rid of gradients in your imaging. And Terry's been using it, and he really likes it. So anyway, I'm going to stop sharing. I hope all you guys are joining us out on the YouTube, and asking your questions. Eric will be organizing them and sending them in. And Jim, I don't know did we ask if you want them? Did you want to be interrupted, or did you want us to pile them up until you ask us for questions?
Well, the presentation's broken into 3 parts, and maybe we'll take questions at the end of each section.
Okay, you're on. Take over.
All right, excellent. I will share my screen. All right, everybody should see my presentation full screen now.
And you're good. Yeah. We can hear you, we can see it.
Well, that's good. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you to the Astro Imaging channel for inviting me to present this evening. It is my pleasure to share what I have learned about filters with the amateur community. First, let me give you a quick overview of my background. So I graduated in 1996 with a master's degree in aerospace engineering, specializing in propulsion and aerodynamics. Since I graduated, I've been working for a defense contractor called Davis Engineering. We design and build infrared suppression systems for ships and aircraft, many of which are in service in the US by coincidence. I live in central Ottawa, Canada, with my wife and 2 teenage kids. The skies from my backyard are a nice, milky Bortle 9+. I grew up keenly interested in astronomy, but did not pursue it actively through my 20s and 30s. There was simply too many other things demanding my time. But around 2009, my kids started showing an interest in astronomy, which in turn reinvigorated my interest in the hobby. Over the past 14 years, my interest has focused on astronomical filters, inspired largely by my bad, lightly polluted skies and my unwillingness to accept the general lack of useful information available on the web about filters. My plan this evening is to share with you much of what I have learned about filters through research, analysis, and testing. So my talk tonight is broken up into 3 parts. The first part will talk about what they are, and the second part about how to use them. And then towards the end, we will talk about some more advanced topics, such as filters used with fast optics, the multi-narrowband filter arms race, how narrow a filter is too narrow, and finally, what's going on with star halos. So without further ado, let's get started with part 1. What are they? Here we see a lovely image of a mountain valley, rich in detail and contrast. Unfortunately, more often than not, something gets in the way of us capturing the view we want. This is where a filter comes in. Their purpose is to block light we do not want to see. By doing this, we can improve the signal-to-noise ratio, contrast, and sharpness of our view, emphasize specific features in the scene, or help to enhance faint details. To give you an idea of what I mean, consider this view of the Flame and Horsehead Nebula taken from my backyard with no filter. Although the objects are visible, contrast and detail are poor. Now add a light pollution filter, and you can see a marked improvement in the scene's contrast and detail. There are essentially 2 types of filters. The first type are most commonly referred to as planetary filters, which are, in essence, color filters, commonly identified using the Raton numbering system. These filters are all absorption type. They block light by absorbing it. The other type of filter goes by several names, including deep sky, nebula, or light pollution. Regardless of the name, these are all interference type filters. They block light by reflecting it. I will explain more what I mean in a moment, but first, let's take a moment to talk about special filters. There are filters on the market that combine both absorption and interference for very specific applications, such as planetary observing, chromatic aberration correction, solar observing, and UV-IR blocking. Although these are also very useful filters to the amateur astronomer, let's ignore them for now. Getting back to how filters work, consider this graphical representation of an absorption type filter. These filters consist of a dye-infused glass or a colored gel that is sandwiched between 2 thin layers of glass. Molecules in the dye are designed to absorb some wavelengths but not others. The result is a filter that can selectively block light, but in a rather imprecise way, in broad bands with gently sloping cutoffs. By the way, if you're wondering where Ratten numbers came from, Frederick Ratten was a British inventor and co-founder of the first photography company in the UK. He devised a standard catalog of filters for use with terrestrial photography. He and his partner, C.E.K. Mies, sold their company to Eastman Kodak in 1912. Kodak still manufactures Ratten filters to this very day. Interference filters are rather different than absorption filters. They are made by adding tens to hundreds of thin alternating layers on a glass substrate. Each layer is made from a material with a different refractive index. At each boundary between layers, light partly reflects and partly refracts. By choosing the thickness of these layers, it is possible to have all the reflections of undesired wavelengths out of phase with each other, so they cancel each other out, allowing only the desired wavelengths to pass through. Interference filters made more than 10 to 15 years ago tended to sandwich the layers between clear glass, just like color filters, because the refractory materials used were relatively soft. Now the materials used are harder than the glass substrate and do not need to be protected. For the next couple of slides, I will describe some commonly used terminology. The first being the idea of a spectrum. A spectrum is a quantitative visual way of presenting how well a filter transmits light at different wavelengths. The example spectrum shown here is the typical format for presenting filter spectra, with wavelength on the horizontal axis and percent transmission on the vertical axis. It allows for easy comparison between filters and provides information on how the filter will perform in different situations. The next term to discuss is luminous transmissivity. Percent LT is essentially a measure of how generally dark the filter is. On average, what percentage of light is getting through? It is calculated based on the specific sensor the filter is to be used with. So a filter will have a different percent LT value if used with the human eye versus a camera. For whatever reason, it seems that the value of percent LT that you sometimes find quoted on manufacturers' websites is the value for daytime human eye use. So not very useful if you're using a camera. For those interested, the actual calculation of percent LT is simply an average, where the filter transmissivity at each wavelength is weighted by the sensor sensitivity at the same wavelength. The next item I'd like to go over is some basic filter nomenclature. This filter spectrum plot is for something called a low-pass filter. All the light at wavelengths below the cutoff are passed, and all those above are blocked. The opposite of this filter is a high pass, where all wavelengths above the cutoff are passed and those below are blocked. If we combine these two spectrums together, we get a bandpass filter. In this case, a wide bandpass. This spectrum type is defined by its center wavelength and its bandwidth, also referred to as its full width half maximum. The The full width half maximum is literally the wavelength width from one side of the band to the other, with the cutoff wavelengths placed where the transmission value is 1/2 the band's maximum. Bandpass filters can come in any width, from wide to narrow. It is also possible to have more than one passband. This, for example, is a multi-narrowband spectrum, which I will discuss more about later. The idea of multiple bands can be taken to the extreme. With some filters that have so many passbands, they are sometimes referred to as comb or notch filters due to the shape of their spectrum. I refer to these filters simply as multi-bandpass. Now that we have some filter lingo under our belt, let's look at some actual filter spectra, starting with absorption type filters. Blue and green filters all tend to be wide bandpass filters, as you can see here in the two images in the upper left. Yellows, oranges, reds, and infrareds are all high-pass filters. Pinks and purples are a combination of bandpass and high-pass that block green. Browns are high-pass filters with some additional green and blue. All of these filters have gentle cutoffs and relatively low peak transmissivity values typical of absorption-type filters. Color filters with steep cutoffs and high transmission are available, but they are all a combination of absorption and interference types. Most of the interference type filters made for astronomy are for use with deep sky objects. They are designed to selectively pass desired emission wavelengths from nebulae, namely hydrogen beta, oxygen 3, hydrogen alpha, nitrogen 2, and sulfur 2. The thing that distinguishes one filter from another is the extent to which it blocks light pollution. In an attempt to make some sense of things, I have created my own deep sky filter categories. Probably the most common category is broadband. These filters have a single large passband around hydrogen beta and oxygen 3 and are meant for visual use. They therefore do not necessarily pass hydrogen alpha. I have, based on bandwidth, further subdivided the category into extra wide, wide, medium, and narrow. The next major category is narrowband. These filters have a single narrow passband around one of the nebula emissions of interest. Hydrogen alpha, nitrogen 2, and sulfur 2 filters are only for imaging, as our eyes cannot see these wavelengths when dark adapted. Narrowband filters in the 10 to 20 nanometer wide range are typical of visual applications, and less than 10 nanometers wide are meant for imaging. The next major category is multiband. As discussed earlier, these filters pass multiple bands and tend to block specific wavelengths known to predominantly contain light pollution. Overall, their ability to block light pollution is moderate to poor, but they do very well at providing a nicely color-balanced view. The final deep sky filter category is a relatively new one that I call multi-narrowband. These filters have narrow passbands around more than one nebula emission. They are often referred to as dual, tri, or quad band filters, depending on how many bands they pass. They are designed to maximize the amount of light pollution blocked, and have recently become very popular with astrophotographers who use one-shot color cameras. So this concludes part 1 of my presentation. If there are any questions at this time, I am happy to answer them.
You don't have any questions yet, but we'll keep watching, Jim.
All right. Well, then I will charge forward.
Hey, Jim, I do have a question. If I can
Sure.
jump in with one of my own.
Yeah, sure.
On the filters that I get, they also call out something called optical density, and I never knew what that meant.
Yes. And I actually will talk about optical density towards the end of the presentation.
Perfect. There's your segue. All right, I'll shut up. Thanks.
If you're able to stay awake to the end, then you'll find out all about it.
All right.
All right. Well, let's move along then to how to use them. Let's open the discussion on how to use filters by starting with solar system imaging. For those of you who are imaging solar system objects, contrast, color, etc., can all be controlled after the fact during post-processing. So a color filter is not needed as one might do when observing visually. The main concern is seeing, the unsteadiness in the view resulting from turbulence in our planet's atmosphere. At a minimum, you should use a UV IR cut filter to sharpen your view and make focusing easier. Alternatively, you can try filters passing red or infrared only, as seeing has less of an impact at long wavelengths. If you are looking for a good all-purpose filter for color imaging, I have had good success with the Baader Moon and Sky Glow filter. It cuts UV IR and also helps to enhance contrast between colors. Moving on to deep sky observing, let's review again what sort of benefits can be realized when using a filter. This is an image of the North American Nebula captured from my Bortle 9 Plus backyard using a 4-inch refractor. With no filter, it is difficult to make out the nebula amongst all of the many Milky Way stars. Adding progressively narrower filters from wide broadband to medium broadband brings out more and more detail in the nebula. You will also notice that the stars are becoming progressively fainter. Adding a UV IR cut filter to the medium broadband filter further increases the image contrast. Further improvement in contrast is achieved by moving to progressively narrower band passes. First, a multi-narrowband filter, and finally, a narrowband H-alpha. Note that all 6 images have the same total exposure time of 5 minutes. So, how does one choose what deep sky filter to use? Well, like planetary filters, we want to selectively block light to increase contrast and signal-to-noise ratio. And interference-type filters are the most capable of delivering accurate, high transmission passbands around our bands of interest. The best filter to use depends on a number of things, including the nature of the light pollution, the type of deep sky object you are trying to observe, the size and type of optics you are using, and the tracking capability of your mount. The next couple of slides discuss these factors in more detail, starting with light pollution. Light pollution is all the light entering your telescope from the sources located between us and the deep sky object. The most obvious source of light pollution comes from man-made outdoor lighting, some of which illuminates our view directly, and some illuminates the sky by scattering off dust and moisture in the atmosphere. There is also a naturally occurring component of light pollution generated, generally referred to as sky glow. This light is emitted by atoms in the Earth's upper atmosphere that were energized by the sun's UV rays during the day. The final naturally occurring source of light pollution is, of course, the moon. It acts like a big mirror, reflecting the sun's rays back at us, thus giving it a broad light spectrum. As suggested by the component spectra shown on this slide, light pollution consists of both broadband and narrowband emissions. To understand the implications of this on our filter choices, we next have to look at the spectra of deep sky objects. Deep sky objects can be grouped into two categories based on the nature of the light they give off. The first category is broad spectrum objects. This includes galaxies, star clusters, and reflection nebulae. Basically anything that we can see because of the light emitted directly from stars. The fact that these objects have broad spectrums makes them very difficult to pick out from the light pollution using a filter. The second category of objects are narrowband emitters. These objects include hydrogen-2 regions, planetary nebulae, and supernova remnants. Any object that we can see because of light given off by excited gases like hydrogen or oxygen. Because these objects emit at very specific wavelengths, they are much easier to separate from light pollution using a filter. The last thing to consider before choosing your deep sky filter is telescope aperture. Recall that filters block light, resulting in a darker view. This means that the percent LT of a filter will limit the aperture of scope you will be able to use it with visually. For imaging, or electronically assisted astronomy, there is no such limit on scope size because you can simply compensate with more exposure time. This does, however, mean that you will need progressively better mount tracking the narrower the filter is you want to use. In my experience, the exposure time required by a filter relative to no filter is inversely proportional to the filter's percent LT. For example, a filter with percent LT of 10% would require roughly 10 times the exposure of no filter. Note that the impact of a filter on exposure time is larger for broad spectrum objects like galaxies. The impact of a filter on exposure time can be offset using faster optics. However, there are other issues caused by this that I will explain in more detail later. Based on the many filters I have encountered over the years, I have been able to estimate that what one should expect in terms of how different filter bandwidths will affect exposure time. Starting with broadband filters, percent LT values can range from 30 to 45% for an extra wide filter, down to 5 to 15% for a narrow broadband filter. Narrowband filters range from 3 to 15% when for visual use, and 0.5 to 5% for imaging filters. Multi-band filters block significantly less light than other filters, with percent LT values between 30 and 50%. Multi-narrowband filters sit between broadband and narrowband, with percent LT values ranging between 1.5 to 10%. Recently, I performed a more thorough survey of narrowband H-alpha filters. Using measured filter spectra, I found that each filter's percent LT fit a simple function of full width half maximum as seen on the chart here. With this information, one can quickly estimate the relative exposure time of one H-alpha filter relative to another. At last, we have come to where the rubber hits the road. What is the best deep sky filter to use? If you are imaging a narrowband object, the best filter to use is the narrowest bandpass filter your mount tracking will handle, regardless of how much light pollution you have, be it Bortle 2 or Bortle 9. Using a filter, including an IR cut, can also help to improve contrast and signal-to-noise ratio. If you are imaging broad spectrum objects from a dark sky, you typically don't need any filters. An IR cut filter can help contrast and signal-to-noise, but the improvement is small. If trying to image broad spectrum objects from a light polluted location, a wide to medium broadband filter that passes infrared works best. Even better contrast and signal-to-noise can be achieved on galaxies and clusters using an infrared high-pass filter, although long exposure times will result. For reflection nebulae, I am afraid there isn't a filter available yet that can appreciably improve the view of these objects.
Jim, sorry to interrupt, but there's
Sure.
a question that's kind of hanging here. You're talking about using one-shot color cameras in this case, aren't you?
No, either mono or one-shot color.
No filter necessary for broad spectrum. So if you're using one-shot color,
Oh, sorry. If you're trying to generate a color image, then yes, you need to use.
okay.
I'm
sorry.
talking about the use of a filter to eliminate light pollution.
Okay, thank you.
So one additional thing to note about trying to image infrared when you're using a refractor. Most ED doublets and APO triplets are okay, but achromats do not do well focusing IR light along with the visible spectrum, resulting in fuzzy bloated stars. The same is true of many camera lenses. For these types of optics, you can see a large improvement in your images by using any filter that includes an IR cut. Besides the beneficial effects mentioned already, filters have a number of other effects on your imaging. The first thing to note is that filters change the scene's white balance. Broadband filters add a magenta hue, oxygen 3 a green hue, H beta cyan, H alpha red, and IR pass a brownish red color when used with one-shot color cameras. Some filters are better than others for white balance. For example, multi-band filters give a good color balanced image. Post-processing may or may not be able to completely correct for the hue added to the scene by the filter, depending on the severity of the color imbalance. Another effect to note is that filters will change your focus slightly because of refraction within the thin layer of filter glass, enough that if you change from one filter to another, there is a good chance you will need to refocus. That is why many users like to purchase all their filters from the same manufacturer, so the glass is the same thickness, permitting filter changes without refocusing. Finally, filters add 2 more surfaces in your optical train to have reflections off of, although anti-reflective coatings can help. Filter surfaces can also collect dirt, dust, or dew. So yet another thing to keep clean. The final aspect of astronomical filters to talk about is cost. It is tempting to try to save money by going with a cheaper option, but quality really does suffer. Cheap filters are prone to reflections, delamination, poor machining, optical distortion, poor optical transmission, and various other issues. There are a lot of filter manufacturers available, perhaps too many. I have listed a number of companies here, organized into 5 groups, ranging from premium filters all the way down to filter brands you should probably avoid. Astronomic and IDIS are 2 of my favorites in the high quality category. Optolong came onto the market as a good value manufacturer, but they have been steadily working to establish themselves as a high quality supplier. Antlia and Ascar are recent additions to the list of filter OEMs, and I have tested a few of their filters so far. As of yet, I am undecided on whether they fit into the high quality category or not. And that brings us to the end of part 2.
And you do have a couple of questions. Let me see if I can just read them so we get them correct.
Sure.
Jerry asks, with regard to multi-narrow band, how accurate is it to split the bands back out of the required image data? This is possible with software like APP, but I've always wondered how accurate it is.
Well, when the multi-band pass filter is used with a one-shot color camera, and this is why that combination is popular, all of the image data on the H alpha band is on the red channel only, and all of the O3 H beta data is only on the green and blue channel. So the camera does the work for you of separating the data, the channel data, for you to then post-process as you wish. Now, one issue with that is some multi-band filters pass more than one wavelength in one band. For example, some filters pass sulfur 2 along with hydrogen alpha. In that case, there is no way of separating those 2 channels from each other, those 2 sources of image data. They are combined together on the red channel of the camera, and once the data is collected, you can't separate them. So that is one drawback of the multi-narrowband filters used with one-shot color cameras, is you really only get 2 bins, I guess you could say, in which to collect the data. The red bin and then the green-blue bin.
And Marcia has another question. He's wondering about the moonlight and the HA and the O3 filters. Does the HA filter out more moonlight than the O3 under a full moon? I think we kind of all had those kinds of experiences, but go ahead.
Yes, I don't know if you remember. I can quickly go back here to the plot showing the spectra for the moon. There we go. So you can see that the moon's emission, because it's a reflection of the sun's spectra, it peaks sort of in the green-yellow part of the spectrum. So if the moon is out and you're trying to image a narrowband, you are going to get a lot more of the moon light coming in through your O3 filter than you are your H alpha filter, for sure.
And I think that's most of us that do narrowband imaging have the same experience. You generally stay away from trying to do O3 anytime the moon is in the region, whether it's full or near full. Are there any questions in the room? I know we have Tim. You have any questions? Anybody else?
Click.
No, no, I
yeah,
have my
I've
question
got-
right.
Oh, I've got one question there. And it may be that I was asking at the wrong time. Eric asked about the, I was asking it about the same time as Eric asked his question. You were saying that with given filters, that it takes longer to get exposure. And if you're using a narrow band filter, I've always been told that and it's focused on the hydrogen alpha, for instance, you get just as much hydrogen alpha with a 3 nanometer filter as you will get with a 5 or a 10. The issue is, though, that you are getting lots of other stuff the broader the bandpass is. And so you're not getting as much contrast. So
That's right.
if all you want to do is expose the hydrogen alpha, then it doesn't matter which band pass you're using. But if you want to get the hydrogen alpha and not the other stuff, then you want the narrower band pass.
Yes.
And the amount of time it takes you to gather a certain amount of hydrogen alpha is the same. The exposure value is the same no matter which of those. Okay.
Well, to be careful. So in theory, you could take 2 narrow band filters of different bandwidths. So maybe one at 10 nanometers wide and one at 3 nanometers wide. And you could use the same sub-exposure time on the same target. If you did that, the image you get with the 3 nanometer wide bandpass is going to be a lot fainter. Even though technically you're getting the same number of photons of hydrogen alpha are triggering your camera, because you have removed all of the additional light that's triggering the camera in that same wavelength coming from light pollution, the overall exposure is less. So it's like light pollution is light that you're adding on top of the signal that you want. So if that's all fine if you had a camera that was an ideal sensor and didn't have limits on the minimum number of photons required to trigger an electron, the efficiency of the sensor, the bit depth, all these real physical limitations of the camera mean that you should be trying to get your exposure up into an optimum range where you're filling your well, all that sort of stuff. You guys kind of know all that stuff. So that is impacted when you add a narrower filter, because you are suddenly removing all this light that was part of your exposure with the wider bandpass, and you need to compensate if you really want to take full advantage of this improvement in contrast that the filter is giving you.
Okay.
Does that
Thank
make
you.
sense?
But isn't it fair to say that if you're only looking at emission nebula, that you don't necessarily have to have a significant increase in the exposure, because your contrast between the background and the other red part of the spectrum that you might capture with a red filter is not there. And there's very little contribution from light pollution from, say, a 3 nanometer filter. So you'd still get the definition of the nebula, even
Yes.
with a comparable exposure, say a 5-minute or a 10-minute.
Yes, that is true. So, and it's, there may even be sort of a personal preference of a sweet spot. If you're happy with a certain sub-exposure time based on the configuration of your rig, then that's fine. You may just end up having to take more subs in order to get your SNR up, because your signal being less has an impact on your SNR as well. The filter improves your SNR, but if you really want to get your best bang for your buck, you increase your exposure time accordingly with the narrowness of the filter to maximize your SNR. And I'll maybe talk a little bit about that in the coming section.
And what you're really trying to do is get definition of the structure of the nebula. ultimately, that's our
ultimately.
what we're trying to do.
Well, let's hear what's happening in part 3 then.
All right.
Okay.
So the topic of narrowband filters and fast optics is the first research topic that I've been working on over the past year. If you can recall from earlier, an interference type filter's bandpass is defined by the thickness of its layers. Thus, if you change the thickness of the layers, you change the filter's bandpass. Well, it so happens that if light is directed through the filter at an angle, you effectively increase the thickness of all the layers. It is also the case that the faster your optics, the steeper the light cone it produces. In other words, light passes through the filter at more of an angle. The net result of trying to use narrowband filters on fast optics is the center wavelength of the filter shifts down, and the peak transmission is reduced. This graph, shown on the left, is of an actual 3 nanometer wide H-alpha filter that I measured with my benchtop spectrometer. You can see how the pass band shifts down and left as the angle of the light passing through the filter is increased. In terms of what this does to how your scope works, it is as if you added an aperture mask. This plot on the right shows what I mean. These curves are my prediction of the effective aperture that results from using an H-alpha filter of varying bandwidth on scopes of different f ratios. Refractors down to a speed of f3, so the blue curve on the plot, do not appear to be affected too much by narrowband filters as narrow as 7 nanometers. With a scope as fast as f4, the cyan-colored curve, it is probably fine to use filters as narrow as 5 nanometers. And an f5 scope, the green curve, as narrow as 4 nanometers, before one would notice any degradation in scope performance. Scopes as fast as f2, the black curve, are severely impacted by narrowband filters, especially scopes with central obstructions, such as RASA or SCTs with hyperstar. Fortunately, filter OEMs have the backs of fast scope owners, as there is a growing selection of pre-shifted filters. These filters have their band passes positioned slightly to the right of the desired nebula emission, so that when the band shifts down on fast optics, the band pass is properly centered where you want it. The next area of research is the ongoing race for the best narrowband filter. These filters have become very popular with one-shot color imagers. This has motivated filter OEMs to work on developing the ultimate filter. They have worked to produce filters with progressively narrower bands in order to increase contrast and signal-to-noise ratio to the max. Presently, there are 18 different models of multi-narrowband filter available commercially. I have plotted them here in terms of the width of their O3 and H-alpha bands. The dot color denotes the cost of each filter. Although I have tested many of these filters over the years, most recently I did a comparison between the top 5 performers: the Optolong L Extreme, Antlia ALPT, Radian Triad Ultra, ASCAR Duo Ultra Narrowband, and Optolong L Ultimate. I made both benchtop spectrometer measurements of these 5 filters and desktop object image comparisons. Sorry, deep sky object image comparisons. My testing resulting in plots such as this one shown on the right. It shows a prediction of not only how each filter performs relative to each other, but how that performance changes with optics F ratio, with the top of the curve being a slow F ratio and the bottom being fast F ratio. Based on my predictions, the Radian Triad Ultra in red, over on the right, does not perform significantly different from the much less expensive L Extreme in green. The ASCAR filter in orange was supposed to perform like the L Ultimate in purple, but instead was found to be no different than the ALPT in blue. I confirmed my predictions by collecting image data on various deep sky objects at different F ratios. Using the images, I extracted luminance values to determine the level of contrast and signal-to-noise ratio achieved with each filter. I found that the measured contrast increase followed the same trend as my predictions, with an offset in magnitude due to the difference in observing conditions and target brightness from what I assumed in my prediction. A similar alignment between predicted and measured was found in my SNR results as well. So, what is the bottom line in the filter arms race? Who is the winner? Well, if we put performance in terms of the cost per unit of subframe SNR, the clear winner is the Optolong L Ultimate, followed by the L Extreme and the Antlia ALPT. The ASCAR Duo Ultra Narrowband and the Radian Triad Ultra did not increase signal-to-noise ratio enough to justify their cost. The next topic I've been working on is how narrow a filter is too narrow. As I have already discussed, there are some advantages to having a narrower full width half maximum, including increased object contrast and increased signal-to-noise ratio. There are also numerous disadvantages, such as increased sub-exposure time, increased mount tracking, increased difficulty with focusing and registration of images, increased sensitivity to F ratio, and perhaps the most important, increased cost. All of this raised a question in my mind. Is there an optimum full width half maximum? Do the benefits at some point get outweighed by the detriments when the bandwidth is too narrow? To answer this question, I took a deeper look at H-alpha filters. I performed a series of tests on H-alpha filters ranging in bandwidth from 200 nanometers down to 1 nanometer. Using the measured spectra for 20 different filters, I first predicted how contrast increase varies with bandwidth. The solid points on this plot are all the filters for which I measured their spectra myself, and the hollow points are the filters for which I acquired measured spectra from elsewhere. I also have added 3 made-up filters, numbers 21, 22, and 23, that represent ideal 2, 1, and 0.5 nanometer wide filters, respectively. Based on my analysis, contrast increase, for the most part, increases steadily with reduced bandwidth, with only maybe a slight roll-off as you get below 2 nanometers. Contrast increase also does not seem to be strongly affected by band shift. Looking now at signal-to-noise ratio, it appears that there is indeed an eventual leveling out of the curve where below a certain bandwidth, around 5 nanometers, there is no significant improvement in SNR to be gained. SNR is also predicted to be much more sensitive to band shift than contrast, as indicated by the vertical length of the lines showing the sensitivity over a range of F ratios. Included in my testing was the capture of image data and the corresponding extraction of contrast and signal-to-noise measurements. Looking first at the contrast increase results, I found that the trend in the measured data with bandwidth matched my predictions. There was an offset between my measurements and predictions due to differences in the observing conditions and target brightness from what was assumed in my predictions. Looking now at SNR, I found a similar alignment between the measured and predicted trend in bandwidth. The offset between the two datasets is similarly due to prediction assumptions plus the fact that I have assumed a perfect sensor in my SNR calculations, so there is no read noise or dark current noise, which has a more significant impact for the wider bandwidths considered in my analysis. When considering both my predictions and measurements, it appears that there is indeed an optimum filter bandwidth somewhere in the 3 to 5 nanometer wide range. The final advanced topic to discuss is halos. This image of the Flame and Horsehead Nebula should be familiar to many people, including this nice juicy halo around the star Alnitak. The presence of halos in astro images is a topic of much debate, with many astro imagers of the opinion that they'd spend more money if it meant they'd get a filter that did not produce halos. Until recently, I knew practically nothing about the topic of halos, especially in answer to the question, what filter properties cause halos in the first place? To answer this question, I performed what is perhaps my most elaborate set of experiments to date. In an attempt to gain as broad an understanding of the problem as possible, I assembled a library of 45 different filter samples from my collection, exposing them to all sorts of tests. The investigations I performed included determining what types of stars produce halos by scraping through my back catalog of deep sky images, determining the impact of filter to sensor distance on halos by collecting image data using a filter known to produce halos, measuring halo severity from images collected with my library of 45 filters, measuring the spectral reflectivity of my filter library using a spectrometer, and measuring off-band blocking for my filter library also using a spectrometer. To help visualize all this data, I was generating I produced plots like this one, which shows how filter reflectivity and off-band blocking correlates with halo severity. In this case, for the green color channel. In this way, it is easier to identify what characteristics were typical of minimal halo filters, wicked bright halo filters, and so-so okay filters. Before we continue to my results, let's back up a bit and talk about physically what a halo is. The general consensus is that halos are caused by reflections off of the filter. This schematic helps illustrate how these reflections manifest themselves. The key optical behavior at play is that when light passes from one media into another with significant air to glass or vice versa, there will be a fraction of the light that is reflected. This results in reflections associated with the filter. Reflections on the objective side of the filter, reflections that occur within the filter and the camera window. What is not widely accepted is which of these is the most important for halos. In my research and testing, the answer is intra-filter reflections. This assumes that there's no reducer or field flattener present, which tends to further complicate the issue.
Jim, could you hold on for a second here? Molly, seems like some of the folks are having Jim break up a little. We're not hearing it on the in the Google group. Okay. Shall we just proceed then, Molly, while you pay attention to that?
Okay, yeah, I'm hearing it. Yeah, I'm actually seeing it in Streamlabs too. I can see the bar doing weird things.
It's a great presentation. We want to be sure we hear everything Jim says. Now I'm breaking up too, huh? Now it's my fault. Oh,
Oh,
great.
weird.
Thanks, Jeff.
Streamlabs isn't showing the weird jumpiness of the bar for you. Gosh. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna have Streamlabs step out of the meeting real quick and then come back in. So
What was that?
hang on. Okay.
Okay.
Now.
Are we any better? I can hear Alex clearly now. Astro Republic. Thank you. Thank you, Molly. I'm going to shut up and let Jim take over again.
All right. Hopefully that sticks. Yeah. Let me know if stuff still goes wrong, people.
Okay. Should I back up or should I just proceed forward?
I think it was only the last minute or two.
Yeah,
Maybe-
I think
maybe-
people are really interested in exactly what causes these reflections. So that was, again, the last couple of minutes.
Sure. Yeah.
of
Go ahead.
What you present.
Okay, so should I maybe start at the top of this slide just so everybody
Yeah.
is okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will back up. Ooh. Okay, so before we continue to my results, let's back up a bit and talk about physically what a halo is. The general consensus is that halos are caused by reflections off of the filter. This schematic helps illustrate how these reflections manifest themselves. The key optical behavior at play is that when light passes from one media into another with significantly different refractive index, such as from air to glass or vice versa, there will be a fraction of the light that is reflected. This results in three main reflection sources associated with the filter. Reflections on the objective side of the filter, so over here. Reflections that occur within the glass of the filter itself, also called intra-filter reflections, so here. Or reflections that occur between the filter and the camera window. What is not widely accepted is which of these reflections is the most important for halos. Based on my research and testing, the answer is intra-filter reflections. This assumes there is no focal reducer or field flattener present, which tends to further complicate the issue. If you would like to see all of my halo-related test results, you are welcome to download the 40-page summary report from my website. For tonight, though, I will only share my final conclusions, the first of which I already mentioned, that the primary cause of filter-induced halos is intra-filter reflections. My finding number 2 is that halo angular size in your image depends only on the filter glass thickness and optics F ratio. Thinner glass and longer focal lengths produce angularly smaller halos. Distance to the sensor has no impact on the appearance of the halo. And this is true when there is no focal reducer. As I mentioned, adding a focal reducer or flattener complicates things. Finding number 3 is that for stars of the same visual magnitude, those with either a very hot or very cool surface temperature tend to produce more prominent halos than stars with moderate temperatures, which is very evident in the star Alnitak, which has a very high surface temperature. But it is also possible for very cool red stars as well. My finding number 4 is that filter off-band blocking is the primary characteristic affecting halo generation, with better blocking resulting in less prominent halos. The final finding is that anti-reflective coatings on the filter help to reduce halos, but they are not as important as off-band blocking.
I'm sorry, excuse me a second, James. When you say off-band blocking, do you mean the amount of cutoff?
I will explain it in the next slide.
Oh, thank you. I keep bleeding you. I keep giving
You're
you.
my straight, yeah, my straight man. Yeah.
You can give me a little credit for it at the end. That's fine.
So before leaving this topic, let's talk a bit more about off-band blocking. This is a typical looking transmissivity plot for a narrow bandpass filter. It has wavelength along the bottom and percent transmission along the vertical axis on the left. There is, however, an alternative way of presenting the spectral transmissivity of a filter, and that is using something called an optical density plot. This plot shows the fraction of the incoming light that is blocked instead of how much is transmitted. Optical density, or OD, is plotted using a logarithmic scale. An optical density of 1 translates to a transmission of 10%. Optical density 2 is 1% transmission. Optical density 3 is 0.1% transmission, etc. Based on my testing of filters, sorry, based on my testing, filters produced, sorry, my text here is a little scrambled. So based on my testing of the 45 filters in my library, I found that they produced little or no halos when their off-band blocking was better than OD4. So that's 0.01% blocking, or 0.01% transmission outside of the passband of the filter. The average off-band blocking of all the filters that I tested was around OD 2.8. So clearly there's quite a range in the filters that are available today. As you might imagine, high off-band blocking filters are hard to make. They require many more layers and a much tighter control on tolerances. And so they have a correspondingly higher cost. So, does a more expensive filter then automatically mean you are getting better off-band blocking? Well, from my testing, for the most part, the answer is yes. But I did find some exceptions. For example, all of the filters I tested that were meant for visual observing had very low off-band blocking on the order of OD 1.5 to 2. My advice to you when buying an expensive filter is, if the retailer has not already reported the off-band blocking, you should ask them what they guarantee to deliver. Well, that is it. Thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. If anyone is interested in reading the test reports from which all this material has been pulled, you can access it from my website, karmalimbo.com/ARO. And if there are any final questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, that was a great presentation, Jim. And I don't think, no matter how experienced we all are, there was a lot to unpack there. And I can't imagine that we'll fully absorb it without going back and looking at that. Is all the information you presented available on your website in one form or another?
Yes, it is. Each of the different topics of more advanced material, that's all contained in recent test reports that have been published within the last year, and that's all accessible off of my website. The more general stuff, you might have to dig around a bit more, but I'm more than happy to answer people's questions if they want to send me an email.
Is there, have any of these data been published in refereed journals? Because it seems like some of the data would be really a subject for that kind of analysis.
It has not. I have been, it's difficult to find venues, to be honest, to publish this type of information. The only venue that I have found that's readily available is Astronomy Technology Today magazine, but that's not really a journal as such. It's more of a trade magazine. So if anybody has any suggestions of a journal that would be interested in publishing this sort of thing, I would certainly look into it.
Well, it just reminded me so much of going to meetings and listening to scientific publications or presentations. But let me get a couple of questions in. One from Linda. Do you have any insights as to how accurate manufacturer's specifications are and how much sample to sample variation there is? And I guess that applies to all the data that you analyze. How much can we trust the manufacturers to put out the data which will influence our decision?
That is an excellent question. And it goes to, if you remember on the slide where I talked about the cost of filters, my categorizing suppliers as being high quality or good value, that part of that designation relates to that exact question. So how repeatable is their product? What are they doing to instill a level of confidence in their product amongst the user community. So companies like IDIS has for quite a while been sending you a printout of your filter's spectrum measured from the batch that it was made, and that's been going on for many years. Something that a lot of manufacturers don't do or haven't started doing until just recently. So that to me is an indication of, okay, this company is willing to, stand behind their product. They're sending you the data of your actual filter. So that's the kind of thing that you want to see. That's not always the case. Like Optolong, for example, they've been around now, or at least popular for about 3 or 4 years. Initially, when they were selling filters, they didn't provide that sort of data. There was no batch numbering on their filters, and a lot of people were complaining and sending filters back because they weren't performing to spec. And I had some of my own experience with that. I have an L-Extreme filter that, when measured, is relatively close to the spec. It's, I think, about a half a nanometer wider on the bandpass, and the peak transmission is off by maybe 5%, which is not bad. But I measured the L-Extreme of another club member of mine, and it was completely different. It was several nanometers off on its center wavelengths. The band passes were different. The transmission rates were off by 10 to 15%. And she purchased her filter after I purchased mine. So it was disturbing to hear and to see, like, oh my goodness, there could possibly be this much variation in this product. And that's, in my opinion, not acceptable. At least the suppliers are replacing those filters, but not everybody has access to a spectrometer to check their filter to see if it's at spec. So it's kind of a difficult situation. And
So
that's why
probably almost nobody has the kind of setup in the spectrometer to do what you're suggesting.
exactly.
So it kind of, I'm sure it makes us all feel a little bit unsettled right now.
Yes. And the only thing that I don't know what to say. Like Antley and Ascar, that is the reason that I said that I am not sure if they can be considered a good quality supplier. I've tested some samples of their filters. One was bang on their spec. Another one was way off. And I don't know if I was just unlucky and got a bad batch or what, but even still, it doesn't give you a warm feeling when you encounter something like that. And I feel bad for people who don't have a spectrometer at home in their workshop to check their filters. And these aren't cheap, right?
Now, Marcia had another question. I think you kind of answered it, but let me ask it again. Are high-speed narrowband filters more prone to halos than standard filters? Are halos more prevalent at longer exposures in high-speed filters, length in high-speed filters?
So the angular size of the halo is larger with higher speed optics. So that may make, if there is a halo, it make it more apparent because it's larger in the frame. Whether or not the high-speed version of a multi-narrowband filter is worse for halos or not, that I don't have a good feel for. I have not tested any high-speed versions of filters because I don't have a high-speed telescope at my disposal. If the filter is built to have good off-band blocking, like I mentioned, then it should be okay for halos. But you need to get that piece of information out of the filter manufacturer. What is their off-band blocking? Has to be better than OD4.
Yeah, and Tim asked just that question. While OB4 is desired,
Yes.
cost could be prohibitive. What OB level should a poor astronomer really look for?
Well, there's a gray area, right? And it's also, what are you willing to accept for the how visible the halos are? Because it is a very gradual scale. It's not like one filter. It's like all of a sudden there's halos, or all of a sudden there's not halos. They vary in intensity on a sliding scale. So it's kind of what you're willing to accept. If the blocking is, better than, well, it would better be better than 3, because that shouldn't be that hard to do nowadays. And they have an anti-reflective coating, then it probably is not too bad. Like earlier Optolong filters, so maybe like from a couple years ago, the ones that I measured, were blocking around OD3. Some of them had anti-reflective coatings, some of them didn't. The ones with anti-reflective coatings did much better. So there's a bit of a combination. Now the newer Optolong filters, like the L Ultimate, which is the latest one that I've had access to, it has OD blocking better than 4, and it has anti-reflective coatings, so its halos are much better than other filters. So you kind of have to, I guess, if they're not publishing this information, the off-band blocking, then you're just going to have to go online and ask people, how are the halos from this particular filter? There's lots of people that complain if they get halos, so you shouldn't have any trouble finding a report on a filter if it generates a halo.
There's no question here, but are you available for consultations on filters?
Yeah, sure. That's no problem.
If someone writes you an email?
Yep. Oh yeah,
you'll...
that's no problem. I don't know if I didn't put my email in the presentation anywhere, but
maybe if they go to your site, there's a place to ask a question.
I don't have that facility on the site, but my email address is listed on the website. So.
Yeah. Okay. Have we gotten to Atlanta Astro's question? Do you find halos are more present in multi-narrowband filters versus straight HA03 narrowband only?
Halos, from what I have found, are most prevalent in the O3 band. So filters that pass O3 tend to have the worst halos. That doesn't mean that a H-alpha filter can't have halos. It can, especially if you're looking at a relatively bright star that's cool in temperature. You can get a halo with that. But predominantly, it's filters that pass O3.
I get the impression that multi-narrowband filters are for one-shot color, and the separate HA03 would be for mono. So you really wouldn't have your choice between those two, would you? I mean, you'd never use both of them at the same time or opt for one over the other. It would be determined by whether you've got a monochrome or a one-shot color sensor, right?
Yes, right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there wouldn't, although people do try using, narrowband, single narrowband filters with a color camera, it's not really the best since because only one pixel is responding.
Out of 4, you get a quarter of the light because you only get 1 pixel out of 4 that picks it up. So if you want to go narrowband filters, then you really should be using a monochrome camera.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can use a multi-narrowband filter on a monochrome camera. You just won't be able to separate the channels after.
Yeah. Okay. I think we got all the questions, right, Eric?
I think we do. Very
we've
interesting presentation. I think we are all thinking, my gosh, we better go back and examine our filters and the spec for them. Not that there's anything we're going to do about it, but
Yeah.
if you want, you can stop sharing. There you
Yeah.
go.
All right. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So I guess it's time to say next week, am I alive? Yeah. Next week we're coming back with Bruce, and he's going to take us on a little adventure. He's got a lot of cool stuff to show us. It's not the traditional the Astro Imaging show with deep space and all that other stuff, but it's pretty cool, interesting things you can do with his taking his pictures. So we'll see you all next Sunday night, and adios.
Jim, we continue on after
Yep,
the
hang on.
program, after the broadcast, so please stay with us.
Molly, thank you for saving our sound
You're
and being in charge tonight, and take us out.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye.